Hi, everybody. We're going to talk about nitric oxide, the gut-brain immune connections. So nitric oxide, the miracle molecule, touches every single physiological process: cardiovascular, the brain, neurological, kidneys, eyes, hormones, immune regulation, the lungs, and even the sexual organs. So why is nitric oxide essential? First and foremost, it regulates all cardiovascular function and homeostasis, governs circulation and microcirculation. The hemoglobin actually requires nitric oxide to be attached to it in order to be able to deliver oxygen to the cells. Supports neurotransmitter function, regulates gastrointestinal function, including gastroparesis, healthy mucous membrane linings, and healthy microbiomes everywhere. It helps activate the GLUT4 receptor in order to translocate and bring glucose into the cell. It is essential for learning and memory. It supports mitochondrial biogenesis, controls the efficiency of mitochondria in the generation of energy and the generation of hormones. This is where cholesterol gets metabolized into pregnenolone. It's essential for sexual function in both men and women. It's required for stem cell mobilization and differentiation. Tells stem cells where to go, what to do. Regulates immune system function, regulates inflammatory response and scavenges free radicals, modifies platelet activation and aggregation, which is so critical in today's viral issue, and supports telomerase activity, which has everything to do with longevity. So we make nitric oxide through two different pathways. One is through the arginine NOS, nitric oxide synthase pathway, oxidizes arginine into nitric oxide. This pathway is pH dependent and oxygen dependent. So if you're hypoxic or acidic, this pathway does not function. The nitrate to nitrite to nitric oxide pathway. Consume the nitrites, they get absorbed, circulate around, they get concentrated in the salivary glands. Salivary glands release the nitrate. We've got good anaerobic bacteria on the dorsal aspect of our tongue that will reduce that nitrate to nitrite. We swallow the nitrite, and in the acidic environment of the stomach, some of that nitrite is reduced further to nitric oxide. This is your protection against E. coli, H. pylori. But most of the nitrite gets absorbed, acts like a nitric oxide donor molecule, and in different tissue, we have different enzymes that will reduce that nitrite to nitric oxide on an as-needed basis. Like in the muscle, the myoglobin can reduce that nitrite to nitric oxide on an as-needed basis. The electron transport chain, acidity. So our ability to make nitric oxide decreases with age. As women, we can hold on to that ability a little better than men until we reach menopause, and then it kind of evens out. So by the time we're 40, our ability to make nitric oxide through that NOS pathway decreases to about 50%. By the time we're 60, this decreases to about 15%. So that is why this nitrate to nitrite to nitric oxide pathway is so critical, because cardiovascular disease is still the #1 killer. So the factors affecting nitric oxide production: aging, we talked a little bit about that. The diet, the standard American diet, devoid of essential cofactors, nutrients, and nitrate-rich veggies. Exercise, the lack of exercise decreases nitric oxide production. Medications, antibiotics, antidepressants, birth control pills, NSAIDs, antifungals, PPIs, proton pump inhibitors, inhibit the production of nitric oxide through both pathways. EMFs increase oxidative stress, oxidative stress uncouples this NOS enzyme. Pollution, glyphosate, genetics, and not just your NOS SNPs. Anything that can increase oxidative stress, your SOD SNPs, your catalase SNPs, your HFE SNPs. If you have any MTHFR SNPs, you are by definition nitric oxide deficient. And stress, the big one, stress uncouples that NOS enzyme. So when NOS is coupled, it is a dimer. And that electron is handed down from NADPH through the flavins to the heme moiety of the NOS enzyme. BH4 is helping to couple it. When a NOS is uncoupled, that electron is handed down not to arginine to make nitric oxide, it is handed down to oxygen and makes superoxide. So when NOS is uncoupled, it becomes a superoxide generator, not a nitric oxide generator. So the rate limiting cofactor is this BH4. And giving arginine to someone who is BH4 depleted with uncoupled NOS can actually increase superoxide production, increasing the NOS uncoupling even more. So arginine is not effective to increase nitric oxide in the aging population and those with chronic diseases with uncoupled NOS. So nitrate actually supports NOS function. Nitrate inhibits this enzyme NADPH oxidase, decreasing superoxide production and oxidative stress. By inhibiting this NADPH oxidase, this allows more NADPH to be used in other processes like the recycling of glutathione, steroid synthesis, fatty acid synthesis. Nitrate upregulates the production of BH4 through the GTP cyclohydrolase. BH4 recouples NOS, increasing nitric oxide, decreasing superoxide production. It increases the activity of SOD and catalase, thus decreasing oxidative stress. So nitrate, through that nitrate to nitrite to nitric oxide pathway, recouples NOS, reduces oxidative stress. So when you're seeing all these studies and you're seeing where increasing nitric oxide production can increase peroxynitrite production and increasing cellular tissue and damage. Peroxynitrite is the molecule that's formed when nitric oxide is in close proximity to superoxide. However, in general, when you're making lots of superoxide, you're typically not making lots of nitric oxide because superoxide shuts down nitric oxide production. There's three main sources of superoxide production in our body. One is uncoupled NOS, and nitrate recouples NOS. Two is that enzyme NADPH oxidase, and nitrite and nitric oxide inhibit that enzyme. And the uncoupled mitochondrial electron transport chain. Nitrite and nitric oxide recouples that electron transport chain. So it's very controversial whether increased nitric oxide from iNOS or any other source injures cells. They use a NOS inhibitor called L-name, and they do see decreased tissue injury and inflammation. However, this may not be due to inhibiting nitric oxide production. There's other actions of L-name that may be at play here. You'll see nitric oxide and metabolites, they may be present, however, not necessarily responsible for the damage. Whenever you have a crime scene, you always have a lot of cops around. And it doesn't mean that those cops are causing the crime, but they're there to help clean up the damage, kind of like nitric oxide does. And can peroxynitrite even be measured? In these studies, they are not measuring peroxynitrite. They're actually measuring nitrotyrosine, and they are assuming peroxynitrite was formed. So this nitrotyrosine is not specific to peroxynitrite. There's actually a new paradigm emerging in the nitric oxide research community that says that peroxynitrite isomerizes to nitrate, which is inert. There's actually many beneficial actions of peroxynitrite. It's possible that peroxynitrite downregulates pro-inflammatory mediators, suppresses NF-kappa B activation triggered by LPS and inflammatory cytokines, limits lipid peroxidation. So superoxide and nitric oxide react to form a cage-like molecule, and 90 to 95% of this rearranges into inorganic nitrate, which is inert. So restoring nitric oxide production decreases superoxide production, decreases peroxynitrite production. This enzyme, NADPH oxidase, or NOx, its only job is to make superoxide, but it's activated by mTOR, histamines, oxalates, aluminum, iron, glutamate, smoking, homocysteine, sulfites, LPS, dopamine, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, pro-inflammatory cytokines, mold, infections, and EMF. And actually, this is where EMF starts its damage, by activating this enzyme. When NADPH oxidase is activated, it preferentially steals that NADPH from other processes. So you've got impaired fatty acid synthesis, impaired serine synthesis, decreased phase 1 detoxification through cytochrome P450, decreased ability to recycle glutathione, and decreased ability to make nitric oxide. You've got increased reactive oxygen species produced by your NADPH oxidase. And this stimulates the RAS, impairs thyroid function, inflames the gut, increases obesity, impairs cognition, increases cardiometabolic diseases, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, insulin resistance, impairs kidney function. You see a vicious cycle of inflammation everywhere. Nitrite and nitric oxide downregulate this NADPH oxidase. So mechanisms of the protective effects of nitrate and nitrite in cardiovascular and metabolic diseases. Nitrate reduced to nitrite decreases reactive oxygen species, decreases peroxynitrite production, increases nitric oxide bioavailability and bioactivity. So nitric oxide in this renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system are intertwined. When the RAS system is upregulated, this downregulates nitric oxide production. When nitric oxide production is downregulated, it upregulates this RAS cycle. So inhibited nitric oxide production stimulates that ACE enzyme, which is really important in the current virus, because ACE is how this virus enters the cell. It increases Ang2, superoxide, and oxidative stress. So this RAS cycle increases interleukin-6, which then goes back to stimulate the NADPH oxidase enzyme, which stimulates more interleukin-6, stimulating mast cells, upregulating inflammation. So supporting that nitrate to nitrite to nitric oxide pathway optimizes nitric oxide, downregulates RAS, and interleukin-6. Nitric oxide is essential in our immune response and is our defense against virus, bacteria, fungi, and other pathogens. Regulates macrophages, T lymphs, antigen-presenting cells, mast cells, neutrophils, natural killer cells. It is an immunoregulator. All the comorbid conditions associated with this virus have deficiency of nitric oxide at its core. So you need functioning iNOS. This is part of the immune response. And you need functioning eNOS, endothelial NOS, which governs circulation and microcirculation to allow these immune components to get in there and do what they need to do. So this virus is considered an endotheliitis disease. You've got vascular damage, and the lung receives the most blood flow of any organ. And you've got increased lung damage, increased hypoxia. The lymph is also a critical part of the immune system, and lining the lymph vessels are eNOS, making the nitric oxide. But during inflammation, this eNOS is uncoupled, not making the nitric oxide, and you're unable to sustain contraction. Iron dysregulation negatively affects the outcome. Ferritin levels are correlated with disease severity. The spike protein attacks the hemoglobin, and it oxidizes the Fe2+, the ferrous iron, to Fe3+, ferric iron. This becomes cell-free heme, and it's unable to carry oxygen. The cell-free heme damages the endothelial cells, including in the lungs. But nitric oxide can scavenge that cell-free heme, but then it becomes not bioavailable to do all those good things. So rapid loss of nitric oxide leads to hypertension, coagulation issues, and systemic inflammation. Loss of endogenous nitric oxide reduces the ability to suppress viral replication, and you've got a failure of the immune response. August 2020, the virus is in the end endothelial disease. Cytokines such as interleukin-1A, interleukin-1B, interleukin-6, and TNF-alpha induce a cytokine storm favoring clotting. And they're saying by inhibiting the inflammasomes, this may be a way to treat the virus. Optimizing nitric oxide during these inflammatory states blocks the cytokine storms, downregulates inflammatory cytokines such as NLRP3, interleukin-1B, interleukin-6, interleukin-18, inhibits clots, and it's protective and reestablishes endothelial function. Here's August 21. Lifestyle-mediated nitric oxide boost to prevent the virus infection. So all these comorbid conditions actually have nitric oxide deficiency at its base. Nitric oxide inhibits the viral entry into the cells. That ACE receptor inhibits viral replication. Nitric oxide supports the host immune response and inhibits subsequent clotting complications. So nitric oxide inhibits the inflammatory process. It's our first line of defense via antiviral, antimicrobial activities. It interferes with the fusion between the viral spike protein and the host cellular membrane. It regulates NF-kappa B activation, which then regulates inflammatory cytokines, chemokines, interleukins, and platelet activating factor. So restoring nitric oxide bioavailability has the potential for preventative and early treatment options. December 21, nitric oxide, the missing factor in the viral severity. Hypertension, number 1 comorbidity, nitric oxide deficiency. Diabetes, number 2 comorbidity, nitric oxide deficiency. So supporting that nitrate to nitrite to nitric oxide pathway actually positively affects obesity and metabolic disease. It decreases it. It enhances the expression of the brown adipose tissue, contributes to AMPK activation and GLUT4 translocation. Nitrite and nitric oxide recouples that electron transport chain, decreasing proton leak and oxidative stress. Nitrite and nitric oxide stimulates mitochondrial biogenesis by activating AMPK in SIRT1, which goes on to activate PGC1 alpha. It suppresses that NADPH oxidase activity, decreasing oxidative stress. So nitric oxide is antiviral, and with increased viral replication, nitric oxide becomes increasingly not bioavailable. The severity of infection corresponds to direct correlation of depletion of nitric oxide levels. Here's a September 21. Evidence of a connection with the virus to exposure to 5G. This virus surfaced in Wuhan shortly after implementation of 5G, spread rapidly globally. There's a statistical correlation in communities with recently established 5G. 5G increases hypercoagulation, impairs circulation, increases hypoxia, increases immune dysfunction, increases inflammation, increases oxidative stress and free radical formation, increases intracellular calcium influx, which promotes pro-inflammatory pathways, worsens heart arrhythmias and cardiac disorders. So all of those are actually increased nitric oxide deficient states. And if you look at this, you will see that all of these health effects from wireless radiation are really similar to deficiency of nitric oxide. It touches every single physiological function. So EMF has been classified as an immunosuppressant. Causes a biological stress response to downregulate nitric oxide. It alters our gut-brain immune axis. Increases the calcium influx, which increases the cytokine storm. When you increase that cytokine storm, you increase susceptibility. It intensifies reactions to mold, Lyme, virus, bacteria, parasites. So EMF increases the damage by stimulating that NADPH oxidase, increasing the superoxide production. And remember that oxidative stress uncouples that NOS enzyme, which increases the superoxide production even more. So oxidative stress plays a role in every single chronic degenerative inflammatory disease. So EMF uncouples that NOS, activates your NADPH oxidase, uncouples that mitochondrial electron transport chain, increases the activity of myeloperoxidase, which increases hydrogen peroxide, stimulates xanthine oxidase, increasing superoxide, stimulates the Fenton reaction, increasing the damaging hydroxyl free radical. And this is iron dysregulation. It increases intracellular influx of the calcium ions, which stimulate NADPH oxidase. So nitric oxide inhibits that voltage-gated calcium channel influx of calcium. Nitric oxide recouples that mitochondrial electron transport chain, which blunts that calcium overload without undermining ATP synthesis. So supporting that nitrate to nitrite to nitric oxide pathway addresses every single one of these factors to decrease oxidative stress. So the virus, a mitochondrial perspective. The mitochondria play a role in inflammation and innate viral immunity. This virus hijacks the mitochondria, increases mitochondrial dysfunction, increasing oxidative stress and inflammation. All comorbid conditions have some sort of mitochondrial dysfunction. And mitochondria can reduce that nitrite to nitric oxide in hypoxic conditions to decrease oxidative stress and inflammation. So what I mean when electron transport chain is uncoupled, instead of handing down that electron to make water, it hands it down to oxygen to make superoxide. Nitrite and nitric oxide recouple that electron transport chain, decreasing that proton link, and stimulates hypoxic mitochondrial biogenesis by activating AMPK in SIRT1, activating PGC1 alpha. mTOR inhibition in the virus. So they're saying that there's a possible use for mTOR inhibitors. The virus co-opt that mTOR and make the host more hospitable for replication. And we're swimming in this sea of mTOR stimulation. Iron, MSG, pesticides, amino acids, estrogens, xenoestrogens, plastics, glucose, insulin, high fructose corn syrup, dairy, folate, certain peptides, EMF. So studies have shown that decreasing mTOR activation can increase lifespan. Decreasing mTOR increases autophagy, which helps clean up the cell. Nitric oxide and nitric oxide donors stimulate AMPK, which downregulates mTOR and allows autophagy. Nitric oxide can prevent senescence, scavenge reactive oxygen species, and increase telomerase activity, which is restored telomere length. Nitric oxide in the gut, part of the gut-brain immune axis. It helps stimulate, increase mucus, a healthy mucous membrane layer. Nitric oxide decrease mast cell degeneration and histamine release. Decreases the inflammatory cytokine release from the macrophages. Increases formation of new blood vessels. Reduces adherence and secretion of the neutrophils. Accelerates wound healing. Decreases oxidative stress and vasodilates. These mast cells line all mucous membranes, and they're the effectors of that gut-brain immune axis. They release histamine, cytokines, chemokines, interleukins, platelet activating factors. They are activated by superoxide, and they're activated in the absence of nitric oxide. And we know how we feel when these mast cells are activated. We have neuroinflammation. So nitrites and nitric oxide regulate the activity of the mast cell and downregulate it. Nitric oxide protects and regenerates mucous membrane lining, our first defense. Stress affects our GI tract, alters GI motility and secretion, increases intestinal permeability and leaky gut, decreases mucosal blood flow, and has negative effects on the microbiome. By supporting that nitrite to nitric oxide pathway, protects that mucus lining, increases mucosal blood flow. It modulates a mucosal immune response, prevents peptic ulceration, repairs NSAID damage, and supports microbiomes everywhere. So supporting nitrate supplementation, you protect the GI health, part of the gut-brain immune axis, inhibiting inflammation, downregulating oxidative stress, scavenging free radicals, downregulate INOS and upregulated INOS, modulator of the microbiome, prevents dysbiosis, prevents and repairs leaky gut, maintains homeostasis. So this was published 2/10/22 from the Israel Ministry of Health post-jab. Israel has the highest jab population of any country anywhere. So tons of neurological issues, tons of cardiometabolic exacerbations. All of these have at their core nitric oxide deficiency. So all of these neurological, these cognitive, these long haul brain fog conditions, nitric oxide conditions. The brain has 2% of our body mass that consumes 25% of our requirement for oxygen. And the brain produces 20 times more nitric oxide than the entire vasculature. We need a lot of circulation and microcirculation going on in that brain. And remember, the hemoglobin needs a nitric oxide attached to it in order to release the oxygen to the cells. So you have impaired blood flow, you have increased risk of neurodegenerative diseases. Got mitochondrial dysfunction. Here's a March 22 study, 1-year trajectory of cognitive changes in older survivors of the virus. 21% of the individuals with severe cases experienced progressive cognitive decline. Got neurovascular events. Neurons are really sensitive to hypoxic injury because they don't replenish themselves like you say an intestinal cell will. So impairment of the blood flow increases neurodegeneration. Nitric oxide inhibits the inflammatory process underlying this viral infection. The virus causes microvascular brain pathology in brain endothelial cells. This is one of the first studies in October 21 showing the virus attacking the brain endothelial cells. This has everything to do with that loss of taste or smell, brain fog and confusion, strokes or seizures, neurological issues. The virus is attacking these endothelial cells in the linings of the capillaries that make up that blood-brain barrier and forming what's called ghost capillaries. These ghost capillaries aren't carrying anything and they're resulting in the death of cells and blockage of blood flow to the brain. They're saying post-acute syndrome includes cognitive impairment and a range of psychiatric symptoms affecting up to 76% of the patients. That's a lot. So add in this EMF to the viral exposure, and you've got altered blood-brain integrity. These tight junction proteins that are in the blood-brain barrier, intestinal tract, eyes, skin, kidney, bile duct, lung, these are important for transport and integrity. When you've got the loss of these tight junction proteins, you see a breakdown of the barrier. You see decreased expression of occludin and claudin 5. See GI inflammation, neuroinflammation. Nitrate increases occludin and claudin 5, protecting these tight junctions and the barrier integrity. BDNF is also a regulator of this barrier integrity. Nitric oxide is the essential mediator of BDNF. With EMF, you see a lot of learning, memory, and cognition issues, neuroinflammation, neurodegeneration. These neurons, remember I said they have increased sensitivity to oxidative stress because they hang around longer and there's limited renewal. So optimizing nitric oxide during inflammation, neuroinflammation, TBIs, blocking the cytokine storm, down-regulating these inflammatory cytokines, decreasing mast cell degranulation, decreasing myeloperoxidase activity, stops the hypoxia, reperfusion injury, limit lipid peroxidation. You're decreasing interleukin 17, which decreases inflammation. You're helping to rebalance those T cells, decreasing the pro-inflammatory Th1 and Th17. You're increasing the Treg cells. This has everything to do with that autoimmune connection. And blockage of neuroinflammation restores neurogenesis. So supporting that nitrate to nitrite to nitric oxide pathway, you're increasing nitric oxide, decreasing inflammation, improving circulation and microcirculation, protecting and supporting those tight junctions. It's a neuromodulator. You're increasing synaptic plasticity, neurogenesis, your neural stem cells, and increasing mitochondrial function and biogenesis. To repair these damaged cells is essential for survival. So with stress, the adrenals require adequate nitric oxide to function effectively, and glucocorticoid production increases in the absence of nitric oxide. Cortisol, a hormone that naturally increases with age, inhibits both INOS, inducible NOS. That's why when we're stressed, we get sick easier. And ENOS, the endothelial NOS, that's why we're in stress, we have more cardiovascular issues, increased hypertension, increased strokes, MIs. Cortisol increases reactive oxygen species, decreases synthesis of BH4, which increases NOS uncoupling, and actually decreases membrane transport of L-arginine. So all of these decrease the production of or make nitric oxide not bioavailable. So this study of March of 22 said increased incidence of type 2 diabetes in people with the virus after recovery. In fact, I have a doctor friend who took his labs during his viral episode, and look, his increased hsCRP, increased inflammation, increased fibrinogen, increased hemoglobin A1C, increased fasting blood glucose, increased adiponectin, increased myeloperoxidase. All of these can be affected by supporting that nitrate to nitrite to nitric oxide pathway to optimize the nitric oxide. In diabetes, that NOS pathway is impaired. It's pH dependent, and diabetes shifts you to a more acidic state. It is oxygen dependent. In diabetes, you've got increased ADMA, which inhibits and down regulates and uncouples NOS. You've got rampant oxidative stress in diabetes. Oxidative stress uncouples NOS. Same with insulin resistance. And remember that GLUT4 receptor requires adequate nitric oxide in order to translocate and bring glucose into the cell. And hemoglobin A1C, the heme part, will bind tightly to nitric oxide, making nitric oxide not bioavailable. So the higher the hemoglobin A1C, the more nitric oxide deficient state. Electromagnetic radiation actually increases hemoglobin A1C in type 2 diabetes. And they've known this for a long time. Back in the 50s, the Russians were trying to tell the Americans. Of course, the Americans didn't want to listen. And then in the 60s and 70s, when they were figuring out how to communicate with submarines with electromagnetic radiation, they saw the increase in diabetes, the increase in cardiovascular disease. So supporting the nitrate to nitric oxide pathway optimizes nitric oxide, down-regulates that renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, essential for GLUT4 translocation, down-regulates oxidative stress and inflammatory cytokines. Sleep. We all know when we're sleep deprived, nothing works right. So impaired nitric oxide production, you see a phase shift in circadian clock and disturbed sleep. REM sleep is nitric oxide dependent. Obstructive sleep apnea is a hypoxic nitric oxide deficient state. And supporting that nitrate to nitric oxide pathway decreases the oxidative stress, down-regulates NADPH oxidase, recouples NOS, decreases ADMA, connected to all-cause mortality. EMF, you have sleep interference. You see a phase shift to circadian biology. This one study showed that constant light exposure in the pineal decreased NOS activity by 80% after 8 days. So nitric oxide chemistry plays a role in the mitochondrial circadian cycle. Nitric oxide is involved in anxiety and depression. You see low levels of BDNF. So nitric oxide mediates that neuroprotective actions of BDNF, promotes neuronal survival, stimulates neurogenesis, which enhances learning and memory, plays a role in synaptic plasticity, actually increases GABA activity in the brain, the inhibitory neurotransmitter. Nitrates increase that production of BH4, which not only do you need for the NOS enzyme, BH4 is required to make your serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, melatonin. So neuroinflammation affects how we feel. And supporting that nitrate to nitrite to nitric oxide pathway decreases oxidative stress and inflammation. Stem cells are how our body heals. It's required for all healing. So nitric oxide is essential for viability, differentiation, proliferation, and migration. So nitric oxide is essential for these undifferentiated stem cells to go where they need to go and do what they need to do. And hyperbarics increases this nitric oxide production, which affect the bone marrow, stimulating the release of stem cells. So you need that nitric oxide to tell them where to go. So right now we're in this perfect storm for low nitric oxide. Age, especially over 40, physical inactivity, the SAD diet, devoid of essential cofactors, nutrients, it's inflammatory, antibiotics, antidepressants, antifungals, especially the azole antifungals, birth control pills. That's why they don't want you taking the birth control pills if you're a smoker or over the age of 35. NSAIDs and COX-2 inhibitors. Look at the NSAIDs and COX-2 inhibitors that have pulled from the market for increasing cardiovascular disease. PPIs affect the production of nitric oxide through both pathways. Achlorhydria, antiseptic mouthwash, fluoride toothpaste, whitening toothpaste with hydrogen peroxide, anything that is affecting your oral microbiome. However, the beautiful thing about nitrate supplementation, it actually helps rebuild those microbiomes in the gut, in the oral cavity. Glyphosate uncouples NOS. Pollution, stress, EMF, everywhere. EMF is everywhere. So nitric oxide production decreases with age, reducing to about 50% by the time we're 40, and as little as 15% by the time we're 60. So supporting that nitrate to nitrite to nitric oxide pathway increases nitric oxide directly, helps recouple NOS to increase nitric oxide, decreasing superoxide, decreasing oxidative stress. So there's a bunch of references. And are there any questions?